Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event with Ambassador Norman Eisen, A Case for the American People, the United States versus Donald J. Trump. My name is Joe Barafati, and I'm a senior majoring in history and minoring in entrepreneurship. I currently serve as the president of the Tufts Pre-Law Society, and I'm a long-distance runner on the varsity cross-country and track and field teams. And it's my pleasure to kick off tonight's event. But before we get started tonight, I want to acknowledge the historic election that took place last week, the results of which were projected over the weekend. As many ballots are still being counted in key states and races across the country, our research team at CIRCLE, or the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, has been tracking the data and providing expert analysis on youth voting in this election. You can explore their latest findings at circle.tufts.edu. We are grateful for the support of our wonderful co-sponsors tonight, including the Political Science Department, Jumbo Vote, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and the Pre-Law Society. Tisch College has many events and civic leaders visiting campus virtually this fall. Thursday night, we will host Chairman Adam Schiff as a part of our Distinguished Speaker Series. And 1 week from tonight, we will host foreign policy expert and former Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. You can find more information and register for those opportunities by visiting tishcollege.tufts.edu/events. And for folks in the Zoom room tonight, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions during the event. If you have a question or two, please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time. Tisch staff will be in touch with you directly for additional instructions, and they will do their best to get through as many of your questions as possible. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Eisen and Dean Solomon. Ambassador Norman Eisen served in the White House from January 2009 to January 2011 as special counsel and special assistant to the President for Ethics and Government Reform under Barack Obama. He was then appointed as the U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic from 2011 to 2014. Ambassador Eisen is a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings and a globally recognized authority on law, ethics, and anti-corruption. He served as special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee for the Trump impeachment from February 2019 to February 2020. In his new book, A Case for the American People, Ambassador Eisen gives a behind-the-scenes account of the attempts to bring the president to justice. Joining Ambassador Eisen in the conversation today is Alan Solomon, the Pierre and Pamela Omidyar Dean of Tisch College. Dean Solomon is no stranger to diplomacy and public service himself. A lifelong social and political activist, Dean Solomon previously served as the United States Ambassador to Spain and Andorra under President Obama. Before serving in Spain, Solomon chaired the bipartisan board of directors of the Corporation for National and Community Service, the federal agency that oversees such domestic service programs as AmeriCorps, Learn and Serve America, VISTA, and Senior Corps. He got his first exposure to national politics as a Tufts undergrad in 1968, when he worked as a page during the tumultuous Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Later, he served as the party's national finance chair from 1997 to 1998, and he played key roles in the presidential campaigns of John Kerry, Al Gore, Bill Clinton, and Michael Dukakis. Dean Solomon has always been a lifelong supporter of Tufts University, having served as a visiting instructor and senior fellow, founding board chair, and now dean of Tisch College, and he's also a Tufts parent, alumni, and trustee. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Norman Eisen and Dean Alan Solomon. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was very, very kind introduction. I appreciate that. And I just want to say what a treat it is for me to welcome my friend Norm Eisen back to Tufts. He's been here before. And I just want to mention what a treat it was for me to actually, I listened to your book, but it really is worth folks picking up and reading. But let's get right to it. I want to start by asking a little bit, Norm, about your own story. Your parents were immigrants. You grew up working in your family's hamburger stand in Los Angeles. Fill in the story from the hamburger stand to Harvard Law School to the White House as Obama's ethics czar to serving as a United States ambassador and then to special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee working on Donald Trump's impeachment.
Thank you, Alan. And it's such a pleasure to be with you, with all the members of the Tufts community tonight. I want to thank Joe for kicking us off, and Jessica for all of her work in facilitating this gathering. You know, when you describe that path from the hamburger stand to my job in Congress, I can't quite believe it. It stuns me even now. I remember vividly, and I write about this in my book. I'm not going to make any efforts to sell my book tonight, contrary to many who appear in this distinguished conclave with Ambassador Solomon. But I may refer to it in a non-mercantile sense from time to time. And I do write in the book about watching the Watergate hearings with my dad when I was 13 years old in our little hamburger stand in Los Angeles. The Food Fair Takeout was the name of our family business. Little tiny stand where my dad miraculously turned out dozens of different foods. And my mother, my father, myself, my two brothers all work there. I had a broom pushed into my hands at I don't know what age. It must have been 5 or 6 for my first work in the hamburger stand. A very typical immigrant story. My mom, a Holocaust survivor from Czechoslovakia, and my father, a refugee who came to the United States in 1940 from Poland. And I was in South Los Angeles, just a few blocks from the barricades of the Watts riots, and it was a warm but tough neighborhood to grow up in, where the hamburger stand was located. And I remember watching those Watergate hearings with my father on our tiny little grease-spattered black and white television. And as I write in the book, my dad saying to me, those are American heroes. And that's the meaning of our country, what's going on, holding people accountable. And I think that's been a thread that's run through my career. After college, I went to work for the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, doing civil rights for all people, 3-year interregnum, fighting for civil rights, then law school, then a 20-year career as a criminal defense lawyer, a political lawyer litigating recounts and elections issues. And then Alan and I, our great adventure from the early days on the Obama campaign, and we say this in a nonpartisan way, that it was a wonderful, the campaign was led by a dreamer, hard-headed dreamer in the part of Barack Obama, my law school friend, who I met because I was a civil rights organizer, a couple years older, gone to law school. He was a community organizer, and we were introduced by a labor organizer. So the accident, when people ask about that path that Alan described, I always say, well, it's my entire career was determined by the admissions officer at the Harvard Law School. That campaign was so wonderful, Alan, because it really was, it was an underdog campaign. You know, the people were not joining that campaign because they wanted to win or become ambassadors, although both of us did. They were doing it because they believed in the mission, and still very close to your dean and many other friends. We have a regular Zoom of that we call the Friends Group. We all get together every few weeks. And then in the White House, worked on the transition. Now we're in another presidential transition on the transition as the Deputy General Counsel in the White House, as the president's so-called ethics czar, his chief political lawyer and ethicist. And Alan and I had some adventures there in trying to do the right thing. No good deed goes unpunished, but we survived, became ambassadors to tell the tale. For me, going back, as I told you, my mother was a Czech Holocaust survivor. So to go back to the house in Prague, it's the subject of another book that I wrote. The history of the century is seen through that magnificent house, which was it's the American ambassador's residence. It was a Wehrmacht headquarters, the Nazi German army headquarters, the occupiers of Czechoslovakia in World War II.
And if I may, your mother said the Nazis took her family out in boxcars and her son came back on Air Force One.
So that was an incredible adventure. And as I know you know from Dean Solomon, there's no job in government that is better than serving your country abroad as a diplomat and as an ambassador. And then from there, so it was a very broad array of careers. I went to a think tank, as you heard, in Washington, Brookings. I started writing books, and I kind of semi-retired. And then President Trump was elected. And I'm believe that we should all support our president. And I worked on the, believe it or not, I helped the Trump transition. And you'll read about that. Even though I'm not selling it, I will hold it up from time to time. You'll read about, I'm truly not selling it. But here's the trick of authordom. The sales really only matter in the first 3 weeks. So then you can just pick the talks you want to do after the first 3 weeks or so. And which is why I was so pleased to come here. So anyhow, I thought I was going to just write books and be a commentator. I had a TV gig, and then I was helping on the Trump transition, and then Donald Trump announced 4 years, a little less than 4 years ago, that he was going to take unconstitutional foreign payments, so-called emoluments. The one ethics rule that the founders and the framers were so worried about, they put in the Constitution, if you're president, you can't take anything of value from a foreign government. Of course, President Trump, and that turned me on the president. That was the moment I said, well, I can't support him. And I've been fighting him ever since. You'll read about that in the book if you take a look at it. And it culminated in my impeachment job. And there I was on the floor of the Senate, one of those fighting for our democracy, just like the ones I watched on the television in the hamburger stand. So that's how I made my journey.
It's a great story. We have something else in common, Norm. My career was also determined by the admissions office at Harvard Law School. The difference is they rejected me. So I never did become a lawyer. So it all worked out for both of us. So I don't want to discourage anybody from reading the book, which is entitled A Case for the American People, the United States versus Donald Trump. But if you could tell us just briefly, summarize the case that you are making to the American people in the book, okay? You're before the jury of 330 Americans. Tell us.
Million.
Yeah, yes. Thank you.
Although it was about 330 in the actual Senate chamber. The case that I make in the book is that that Donald Trump has betrayed the Constitution and his oath. And now the American people have delivered the verdict on his behavior through a pattern of radical selfishness, of putting his own interests first to the detriment, the neglect, and the positive suppression of the interests of the American people. And I argue in the book that the first example of this came in the Russia investigation, starting when in the in the campaign of 2016, he said, Russia, if you're listening, and he called on, you'll be mightily rewarded by our press if you find Hillary's emails. And the amazement in that moment of an American president promising a media reward but we know he was hinting at other forms of reward too, that he would reward them for an illegal act, a criminal invasion of his opponents, of another American's hacking of their emails was so shocking. And that quid pro quo, you'll be mightily rewarded. That pattern is one that would continue, and that's the case I make. And then the next, and that ran all through that pattern of contempt for the law, ran all through his attacks in the Russia investigation, on Robert Mueller, on the witnesses, on juries, his attacks on the truth, his blandishments, the quid pro quos, the exchanges that he was offering to witnesses if they wouldn't turn on him. And some didn't. Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, some did. Michael Cohen, then he would threaten them. Then we saw the identical pattern. And that's what I went to Congress, I read in the book, to impeach. And Congress would not impeach. And it looked like I was there. I'd gotten back to work.
Let me ask you about that. You become the special counsel to the Judiciary Committee, to Chairman Jerry Nadler. And originally, you had drafted 10 articles of impeachment. And initially, Speaker Pelosi didn't want to proceed. Then things changed. It went to 3 articles, and it wound up being 2 articles. Tell us a little bit about how that evolved.
So imagine the shock, and this is what, I got there, and the behavior was so, Trump's behavior was so bad that I had these secret articles. I'll show you. They're here. I marked it, and they continue over here. So those are the actual articles. I have my draft in the other room. We couldn't talk about it. And then imagine our shock. We have these draft articles. Imagine our shock when the president does the same thing again with Ukraine. It's the same pattern. It's the case for the American people. He tells Ukraine, instead of Russia, are you listening? He says, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, Ukraine, are you listening? Can you do us a favor though? And if you look at the transcript of the July 2019 phone conversation with President Zelensky, it's the same thing, asking a foreign party to attack an American political adversary, this selfishness. He cares only about his own interests, and the quid pro quo, promising Ukraine the reward. And that was the pattern. That's what got us to the 3 articles. And they were 1 article for the underlying wrongdoing in Ukraine, for the quid pro quo. We titled that Abuse of Power, and that was in the original articles. The 2nd article for obstruction of justice, and a 3rd article for the Mueller investigation, obstruction of Congress. We ultimately merged the 3rd article into the first 2 articles as a pattern, because that's the case for the American people, the repetition. And what was fascinating was that one of the witnesses I examined, an expert witness from Stanford Law School, Pam Carlin, said, imagine, I'm paraphrasing, she said, imagine if Trump said to if there were a national crisis in the United States, and Trump only thought of himself, and he said to a governor, can you do us a favor though, when a liberal state needed help? And of course, that was exactly what transpired with COVID. So the pattern, radical selfishness, quid pro quo, sacrificing the American people, that is the pattern that has carried forward. And those 3 episodes are the subject of the book. And that's the case that I made to the American people. And I hope in my own small way, I contributed to their delivering a guilty verdict for Donald Trump.
Well, the House did, but once the impeachment trial began in the Senate, the Republican majority refused to allow any witnesses to be called. Do you think the outcome would have been any different if you were allowed to call witnesses? And you always knew that it was going to be difficult, if not impossible, to get the Senate to convict. Was it worth bringing the articles of impeachment in the first place, given that likelihood?
Strongly worth it. The first thing that I wrote when I emerged from impeachment was an article for the New York Times, an op-ed for the New York Times, explaining why it was worth it. My daughter asked me, was it worth it? Abba, was it worth it, Dad, at breakfast one morning? And that got me thinking was it worth it? And I think it was worth it. And it's for a number of different reasons. Number one, I don't know about you, but I set multiple alarms to wake up in the morning. And I like to think that Russia was the first. I set 3. Russia was the first alarm. Ukraine was the second alarm, and COVID, which I explained, same pattern, was the third alarm, and the American people woke up. That's number one. Number two, all this horrible nonsense and still continuing with Hunter Biden and this fake dossier. You know, I was the White House ethics czar, and Alan knows I was not a gentle one. He and I together had, you have to make some very tough calls in government. We together managed to oust a very unethical person from the government. I was no gentle shrinking violet on ethics rules, but there was no rule forbidding Hunter Biden from working for that company. It's not against the law. It's not against the rules. Many adult family members do that kind of thing. And we managed to, I think, draw the sting. I'm afraid we would have had a repetition of the October surprise right down to the fake documents if that had not been thoroughly ventilated. So that was not in a partisan way, but for the sake of our country, impeachment was an inoculation against disinformation. And so that's the second reason I thought it was so important. And then the third reason is it sent a message to America and the world that in the United States, no one is above the law. And I would do it again in a heartbeat. And there was no real dissent. When the second alarm went off in Congress, there was no real dissent. We had to do this. It was the right thing to do. And I think history will be kind to the impeachers. And you can ask Adam Schiff about it when he's with you later this week.
I will, and I'll attribute it to you if I may.
You may.
How do we understand then that not a single Republican senator, well, only one Republican senator voted to impeach, that they wouldn't allow any witnesses? Would it have been any different? Would it have been any different if witnesses had been allowed? How do we come to grips with that fact?
I've tried many cases, and between us, myself, my co-counsel, Barry Burke, who's an important personage in this book, we did everything together, and we still do everything together. We're now doing a big election protection program together, which I'll talk about a little bit, a brand new one that I've helped found. Between us, we've probably done hundreds of trials. And one thing we know is no matter how hopeless a trial is, you never know until you put the witnesses on the stand and you examine them and you give the jury the choice what will happen. So we believe, I write a lot about this in the book, we believe that it was a terrible excrescence of justice that the Senate did not allow.
The first alarm?
It's my Republican buddy, Bill Kristol. But you're more important to me. We should have him as a guest.
No, we did. Actually, we had Bill Kristol.
I should answer the phone and tell him where I am.
We had Bill Kristol and Nara Tandem about a year ago.
Oh,
together.
Wonderful!
He was wonderful.
Wonderful.
But you tell him to call him back.
So I've just put the links to my new venture in the chat because I want to talk to you and in particular to the students about it. Congress, if we could have gotten just one key witness, he was the one witness who could have blown the whole thing open, and many Republicans told me if they heard from him, he could change their minds, John Bolton. And I describe at great length in the book our efforts, tragicomic efforts to get John Bolton to come and testify. And we were negotiating with him right up until the last days of the trial. 75% of the American people said that it was wrong of the Senate not to have witnesses. And that was also very important in making the case. We had persuaded even half of Trump voters that we should have witnesses. So I think that it was a terrible, shameful failure, but the totality of the case is one that seems to have, that did persuade the American people in this very important election that they'd had enough of Donald Trump.
You also write about some of your former teachers, colleagues, other lawyers that you were friends with who visited you in Prague, who became some of President Trump's strongest defenders. I mean, two that come to mind are Ken Starr and Alan Dershowitz. Again, given the case that you make that is so compelling, how do you understand people like that coming to his defense?
Well, there's a proud tradition in American culture of defending everyone. And it starts, of course, with your great fellow Bostonian, John Adams, who famously defended the British soldiers in the time just before the American Revolution, when they had committed murder, I believe, and they were hated and loathed, and yet he felt everyone deserves a defense. What they don't deserve, and this is where I'm a little severe, I'm more gentle with Ken, I'm a little tougher on Alan, I'm very tough on my friend, I don't think he's talking to me anymore, Pat Philbin, who I really admired. And I explained that some of these very admired figures just went too far. And there is a line that you must not cross as an attorney, and I say as a human, and that is the line of lying. And they became too much like their client. And I don't mind, that's why I make the point with Ken Starr, with some of the members of the Senate, they continue to be friends. I disagree, obviously, with some of the decisions they made, but to cross that line and make false legal or unsupported legal and extreme legal arguments or false factual statements, I could, that won't wash. And I take them to task in the book, and none of them has called me, other than Ken. I was very gentle on Ken. I fear that I may have affected those friendships, and it pains me, but I will say I have a rule. If you're going to be tough on others, you should be toughest of all on yourself. And the book is full of my own mistakes, blunders, errors, and failures. And there were plenty of those along the way.
Let me ask you one other question about impeachment, just behind the scenes. So there were also some divisions on the Democratic side, and you worked with three very powerful, very important leaders of the Democratic caucus and in the Congress, Congressman Schiff, Congressman Nadler, and Speaker Pelosi. And there you were now you were working for Nadler, but you were sort of trying to also find consensus and also be respectful of the leadership. What was it like working with that triumvirate?
Well, they're like the great triumvirate of the 19th century that was led by Henry Clay in the United States Congress. They're all incredible figures, incredibly different figures. Pelosi is one of the most important, and you know her well, Alan. And you know, she's been a friend for many, many years, a family friend. We had some tense moments in the impeachment. We hugged it out at the end when you still were permitted to hug, and we're now on the best of terms. I did something nice for her the other week, and she said, "Norm, you're my hero," made my week. So we did have some tense moments along the way because I believed, you'll read my 10 articles, I just believe we had crossed the line. And, you know, it's not I thought that he should have been impeached for the Mueller conduct. And you'll read about some of my mistakes that, you know, things I could have done better that might have made that possible. Pelosi is one of the great geniuses ever to occupy the speaker's chair. And if you haven't, you know, had the opportunity, there's a very good book out by Molly Ball. I know I shouldn't be selling other people's books. Oh, do you have it there, Alan? Pelosi. It's a wonderful book. Put that down and hold up: A Case for the American People. It's bad enough that I'm undercutting myself, but to have my friends do it is shocking. So Pelosi is a great genius. In a funny little coincidence, her political mentor was Mayor Joe Alioto, who told her, "You're too talented." You know, she had 5 kids. "You're too talented. You should go on the San Francisco school board or library board." I can't remember which it was, one of those municipal boards. And Mayor Joe Alioto, all these years later, I'm writing this book, and my editor is Mayor Joe Alioto's daughter, who is the best of friends with Nancy Pelosi. So, so that's Pelosi. I admire her. She's magnificent. One of the all-time historic greats. Adam Schiff, you've all seen, is one of the finest orators that and thinkers that our Congress has ever produced in its distinguished history. And, you know, I had the privilege to be there up close, front and center, for so many of his brilliant remarks when on impeachment day, when the articles of impeachment passed, and then day after day sitting directly across from him at the table. The managers sat on one side and the counsel for the managers sat on the other. And Schiff and Nadler, as the 2 most senior, sat across each other from the table, and Schiff's counsel across from him, and me and Barry across from Jerry. And then we, you know, provided support to the rest of the managers. And just a magnificent orator, wonderful, wicked sense of humor that comes out and you'll see it comes out. That's probably the worst thing I could do, is to talk him up like this. But really, a Churchillian figure for us. And you'll see a lot about his process in the book and how he would improvise these speeches on the spot. Magnificent. And then Jerry Nadler is the least famous and probably the least well understood of the 3. Nadler is a totally different, but also protean congressional figure. He, for political success, who's clawed his way from New York State Assembly to Congress to the historic chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, one of the most unpolitical people I've ever met. He just calls it like it is at all times. He does not trim his sails. He says what he thinks. It gets him in trouble. He believes it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. And he just barrels, he just plows ahead. But I think, you know, his truth-telling got us in hot water at times in the impeachment, because he told Congress, he saw the writing on the wall that the Senate was going to acquit Trump. And like a Old Testament prophet, he told off Congress in very strong words when the other side lied, and they did lie. He said, "That's a lie. The Senate is not used to such straight talk." So Jerry, but he's a brilliant constitutional scholar. He's exasperating. I love him. we would speak Yiddish together. My co-counsel, Jerry and Elliot Engel and I are all Yiddish speakers. The former chairman, the outgoing chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee. And, we would speak Yiddish with each other. And Jerry Nadler is just a unique figure up there in Congress. And so 3 very different, but all wonderfully literary characters. It's a writer's dream to be up close with 3 such distinctive personalities and historic ones.
So let's move from that recent history to the moment at hand. You're working on efforts to stop President Trump from challenging the results of the election. Are you concerned that he may succeed, and what's the strategy for preventing that?
Well, I've put in the chat. I don't know if everybody can see it, though. Maybe they can't get into the chat, all of our visitors. So I've put into the chat a little description of my newest venture. I was very flattered to be approached I no sooner finished a case for the American people. Literally, I stayed up all night on Sunday night. It must have been the last August, September, October, November. It must have been the last night do you know when the book came out, Alan? Do you remember what the date of the book release was? Well, it doesn't matter.
Let me look at my sales slip.
I stayed up all night to finish the book. We had a crash deadline on this book, and we finished proofing the last of the proof sheets, and the book was in print 3 weeks later. It went straight to the printer, and they rushed it into print because we wanted to make the case in the run-up to the election, and the book came out at the end of August. So no sooner did I finish that, so it must have been the very end of July, beginning of August. I literally was sitting on my couch. I had been finished. I'd sitting there sleepless 5 minutes when I got a call from the representative of the Democratic state AGs. We have some questions about this coming election, and one thing and another. Oh yes, okay, Shanley has sent it on to everyone. One thing led to another, and as you can see, we started a new bipartisan group, rule of law and law enforcement group, governors, former DOJ officials, former U.S. attorneys, prosecutors, state, current and former sheriffs, law enforcement, and state AGs to defend the election against just the kinds of attacks that we're seeing now. Big effort. We were active in 25 states in the run-up to the election. And a couple links, you can see my board and a nice Washington Post article about the venture. So I assess that, I was very nervous last week as we were waiting for the election to be called. My assessment is that that we will withstand the next 60 days, but I think that there's a lot of flailing and failing going on the litigation front, because the truth is we had a very free and fair election. We freely and fairly counted the votes. There's still some mop up. It's very clear what the margins are going to be in these states. And it's undisputed who the president-elect and vice president-elect are. And I'm sad. I'm not surprised. I warn of it. In fact, the very last part of the book talks about this, and the very last paragraph in the book hopes for and perhaps predicts a land sufficiently large, and I think over 300 electoral votes is sufficiently large, 309, I think it'll end up, a large margin that the election will be impregnable. That doesn't mean we won't have turbulence and disinformation and litigation. We will, but I think that we're going to be just fine. And I think I really believe that, and I say this in a nonpartisan way, that there's a hunger for the country to get back to normal. And I think we're going to see some remarkable achievements. And of course, wonderful news about a vaccine today. So,
well, and if you go to circle.tufts.edu, You can see the data on youth turnout. You can see that the margin by which young people voted in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, and in Georgia was completely was really larger than the margin, by the way, by which the president-elect won those races, and so played an enormously important role in the outcome. And that's this next generation that we're talking to this evening. So bravo. But we have some, speaking of our audience, we have some students who I believe are prepared. Jared Miller is the first. And so I'm going to now ask Jared to ask his question and tell us your name, where you're from, Jared, and what you're studying.
Thanks, and thanks, Ambassador Eisen, for being with us tonight. My name's Jared. I'm a PhD student at the Fletcher School here at Tufts. And my question actually goes to broader legal frameworks for holding politicians accountable. You mentioned that no one is above the law, but a question if our law is actually up to the task. From McDonald v. United States in 2016 onward, it seems like there's a deepening gap between what many of us would see as corruption, but what our legal system might not actually characterize as illegal acts. What is your take on this, and where do we go from here?
Jared, thank you for that. I think that the biggest crime, I like to say, in Washington, the biggest crime is what's legal. And the slew of big money, and you have to, Alan has retired. Alan has retired as a fundraiser. Except for Tufts,
not for Tisch
except
College.
for Tisch, except for Tisch. I still dabble in such things. There's nothing wrong with supporting candidates and causes with all of your energy. What's happened that's terrible is that people tie the giving to policy interests, and there's a nexus, and it is part of what has, and I saw it, and I went in the White House to fight it, and they got very angry at me for doing that. But I have hope that nexus, and it is, it is the people give contributions, and lobbyists bundle them up, and then they want political favors in exchange, and that's lawful as long as it's not an express quid pro quo. As you point out, in the McDonald case, it's become permitted now, to have behavior that that should be illegal. But there's hope. There's a big new bill called HR 1 that moved in this Congress that seeks to change many of these. Now we've got to get it through the Senate. I'm not giving up hope on on having a Senate. There'll be runoffs in Georgia. We're waiting on Alaska results, putting Alaska to the side. I'm not giving up hope of having a Senate where you have a sufficient number of Democrats and one or two Republicans who are fed up, like me, will cross the aisle to join my fellow Democrats and pass HR 1 or something like it. Now, I won't be falsely optimistic. It might not happen in this Congress, but I think there's this election, there's a wave of revulsion for the corruption in the White House. And I'm hopeful that this link between legal corruption is severed for once and for all. And that's part of what was so wonderful about our crew on Obama. They only wanted Obama to be elected and to do the right thing. Everybody else who wanted, because nobody really believed it was going to work. We were there out of love, not for a reward. And that's why those people still remain many of my closest friends in politics. And I hope the whole country will reorient that way, or at least and HR 1 could do it.
I have to say, though, Norm, I gave a talk to the political science department at Tufts in the summer of 2008, explaining why Barack Obama was going to be elected president. I had no particular interest in what had no plan to serve, but there were good signs.
There were predictors.
Let's go to Steve.
But Alan, you got to give me a rebuttal, like in the presidential debate. You have to admit that it was a long shot. And like when we were in October in Des Moines together for the campaign meeting, remember, and that Des Moines poll came out, and we had to win Iowa. There was no other path. And the Barack was 9-10 points behind Hillary in October. And we said to him, how are you? He came and talked to me and Alan and some other people on the campaign. And like, how are you going to do this? And he said, don't worry, guys, I got this. And ferocious kick in that last lap. And the rest is history.
Well, and
my wife was also positive, like you, that he could win, Alan. And Tom Miller, who's the AG of Iowa and my political mentor from many, many losing presidential campaigns in Iowa. I got to be friends with Tom over the past 30 years. Tom said to me, no, Norm, he's going to win. He's the greatest candidate since John Kennedy. So I would have done it. I quit a job. I had a job on the Hillary campaign that I quit. I'm a big Hillary fan. I quit to go to work for Barack because he was my friend. But I was dubious, and I was never more delighted to be proved wrong.
Well, we have a very important questioner next, who also served in the Obama administration at the State Department. Steve Coltai is a double jumbo. Tufts undergraduate as well as Fletcher, a good friend. And so, Steve, you have the next question.
Thank you. And I'm also an Angelino. And we're all about the same age. The first thing I just want to say is like everybody, I'm on lots and lots of Zoom calls, all sorts of organizations. And we are so lucky at Tufts with Dean Solomon, the lineup that we have of people who are speaking, including you at the top of the list, Norm, is just
Thank you.
Extraordinary. And we're very, very lucky and very grateful. I had a totally different question lined up for today, but I just have to ask this rip from the headlines question about Defense Secretary Espy. I am just curious what the legal and constitutional safeguards are about how the military, to what extent the military is required to execute the orders of the commander-in-chief up until January 20th. The issue with Espy, of course, was the disagreement they had about the Lafayette Square protests. I mean, that was the public one. I'm sure there were others as well. So, what if that happens again? What if the president asks the military to do something again?
Well, I talked to a lot of people in connection with my new venture that is in the chat. I would only, and they include former military, including some very high-ranking former military. And I don't believe that the military will perform illegal acts at the behest of the president. I think there's an acknowledgement at all of the levels of command. They've learned the level of Lafayette Park, the lesson of Lafayette Park, and I just don't think that they will do it. We will have to wait and see. There's no guarantee, but when Esper and Milley both admitted they had made mistakes, and of course, alarming that Esper's gone. That's a warning sign for us, certainly. I have confidence in our nation's military to do the right thing, and they see what they're up against. So, that is not one that that I think, and you know, the military family, there's so many of their top leaders, of their most distinguished members who have been tried to serve Trump, the Mattises and the Kellys and the H.R. McMasters. They tried to serve, they failed. I think the military families, the family writ large of current and former military understands, and you know, they're trained not to obey illegal orders, right? So I have some confidence in them at a visceral level. It's not entirely analytical. Some of that is an emotional judgment.
And if you read today's NPR interview with former Dean of the Fletcher School, Jim Stavridis, he, in the military family, is among them. Let's go to the next question. Thank you, Steve. Good to see you. Bruce is up next, I think.
Guess so. I was a student at Tufts a few years ago and was right next to Fletcher School in my dormitory. My question is, well, first, I was really disappointed that the Chief Justice did practically nothing in the impeachment trial of Trump and frankly of Clinton as well. And even Rehnquist actually bragged about it. And I don't think that's what the framers intended. So my question is, what can we do to actually have the Chief Justice play an actual role and being sure that we have a fair and a respected trial of presidential impeachment?
Well, I have a different, you know, I'm not gentle, Bruce, on those who don't deserve it in this book, but I have a different feeling about John Roberts. First of all, I thought it was an eye-opener for him. I watched him often, and I'll confess that he's someone that I've known since he was, I think, since he was in private practice. One of the great things about being ambassador is that people come and visit you, and John came twice, and he stayed with us on one of those occasions. And I know him from before. So maybe I'm not particularly gentle on my friends like Alan Dershowitz, who I think did the wrong thing. He said something towards the end of the trial. He ruled that he would not have broken a tie on witnesses. And he said, look, I'm not democratically elected. This is a democratically elected body, and you should make those choices. You're accountable, I'm not. And I thought that was a wise judgment. I thought he was fair in the questions we put to him. And I think the bigger problem for impeachment is, I'm not severe on the Chief Justice. I thought he was fair. I'll take one other example. There's more, but I'll just, for the sake of brevity, offer you one other, and I have a longer list in the book. You know, at one point, as I said, Mr. Nadler can be a little impolitic, and he gave some very stern medicine on the opening night of argument in the impeachment trial when we were doing our first arguments about witnesses and resolutions. John was careful. I think really he was chastising Jerry for his strong tone, but he was careful. The other side had done some things too, and he was careful to say both sides must. I thought he was so wonderfully even-handed as a judge. He paid attention. And here's the last thing I want to say. I think he saw, we may yet see the value of the impeachment, if for nothing else than exposing John Roberts to the kind of president Donald Trump is, because he saw day after day the evidence. You know, we used video to bring the witnesses in and visuals, and it was really like a modern trial. That's the only thing of its kind, the best thing of its kind, people said to us, that had been done. The thing we need to restore integrity and quality to impeachment is to have true public spiritedness. I genuinely believe that if this had been a Democratic president, who had engaged in this pattern of behavior, that the Democrats would have joined with the Republicans to provide the 67 votes to remove him. I know those Democratic senators, and I genuinely believe it. So there is an asymmetrical decadence that has set in on the other side of the aisle, and that's something to be contended with. That's the thing that is crippling impeachment. Ultimately, our institutions are only as good as the people who run them, but there are pleasant surprises in the rule of law too, and John and his colleagues, John has frequently crossed the aisle at the Supreme Court to do the right thing in the era of Trump. So that is good news on the rule of law front.
So we have 2 questions remaining, and I think we can get through both of them. Jordan is up next, but I want to say, Jordan, if I recall correctly, did a Tisch Summer Fellowship, an internship with the ADL in Washington when he was an undergraduate just a few years ago. Right, Jordan?
Yes. I was also a Tisch scholar during my time there, so very involved with Tisch.
Hi, Jordan.
So Hi, Norm.
Jordan.
Thank you so much for
Wonderful
hosting
to
this,
see
Dean
you.
Sullivan, and great to see you, Norm. I was wondering, as this administration comes to an end and we can look to the future, what reforms do you think Congress needs to pass to restore their oversight abilities and to help us better respond to impeachable conduct in the future?
Well, Jordan and I worked on some of those remedies, of course. I'm going to have a Brookings report come out. I think HR 1, which I talked about, is aptly named. That should be the first order of business to clean up the voting process. It's a mess. To get dirty money out of politics, and to make ethics reforms, including in presidential behavior. We can do more in those and other areas that are in the bill. Beyond that, I think it's critically important, something Jordan and I worked on together. DOJ needs to function much better. We need to have better DOJ accountability. And I'll give you, there's a list. I have this report coming out with a bunch of colleagues from Brookings. I'll give you another one that I think is very, very important. I think Congress needs to be able to enforce its subpoenas much more quickly and forcefully. It doesn't have that power now. You have to go to court. We're still litigating subpoenas that we issued during the earliest days of impeachment. And that makes no sense at all. So strengthening congressional oversight is another important reform, and many, many others. And look for my Brookings report.
And I'm sure he's going to talk about it on Thursday, but Congressman Schiff has brought a bill to the House. He's introduced a bill along with actually Chairman Nadler and some of the other Democratic chairs, which would be reform package. It's called Protecting Our Democracy Act. And one of the pieces in the legislation is to enforce subpoenas. Another piece is to actually provide a greater definition of emoluments, even though it's in the Constitution. Well, we have one more. We have one more questioner. Minako, please introduce yourself and go ahead. I think
Minako, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for coming, Ambassador. I'm Minako Tatino. I'm originally from Japan. I'm a student at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. Before coming to the United States, I have worked for the Japanese Foreign Ministry. So I'm so pleased to meet you today. Thank you very much.
And you.
And my question is slightly different from politics, but I want to ask you that what kind of characteristics is very important to be a diplomat or being ambassador?
Well, Minako, I want to thank you for that wonderful question, and it's a suitable exit for me, and you'll forgive me because I have a hard stop at 7, friends. Otherwise, I would linger. The most important characteristic, I think, to be an ambassador, it's the blend of things that Alan tells me that Tisch cares about. Sharp analysis, yes, rigor, study, but also humanity, decency. The most valuable tool I had was going to meetings well prepared, but the people at those meetings knew I cared about them. I had an advantage as a prodigal son returning to Prague, where my family had been previously. So the qualities, I would say, to balance the qualities of the head, of the intellect, with the qualities of the heart is the most important. Your dean, Dean Solomon, does that as well as anyone I know. You've all demonstrated it through your wonderful questions today, as has he. It's such an honor to have been with you, and I thank you all. Have me back. Don't wait till I write my next book.
Okay,
Have
Norm,
me back,
thank you
friends.
for sharing both your head and your heart with us. Good night, all, and we'll see you Thursday night. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
friends.
you very much. Bye now.